I'm Suzanne Stumbo, and I'm the agriculture agent for the Pike County Extension Office. And the first thing we're going to discuss is beef. Beef has great potential for eastern Kentucky, but you need to keep in mind it takes more acres of grass to produce a cow-calf unit than it does in the bluegrass, but it takes much less than out west. Some areas of out west take as much as 90 acres to produce one cow-calf unit. Several successful examples on reclaimed land are found in eastern Kentucky. The main thing you need to keep in mind is fencing is expensive, and you may need working equipment.
Hello, my name is Kenny Burdine. I'm an extension beef economist at the University of Kentucky Department of Ag Economics. I'll talk a few minutes today about basic startup considerations for a cow-calf operation. Three main topics to walk through. First off, talking about basic startup cost, initial startup, and so forth. Walk through a quick budget approach, talk about potential returns and some estimated cost in the current market environment, and finish by talking about some key considerations to keep in mind as you go forward. Startup cost, pretty basic to begin with. The big one's obviously land both for grazing and potentially land for hay production if you don't purchase your hay. In terms of land, also think about improvements. Land alone is not enough. Think about things like fencing resources. Water's oftentimes overlooked. Things like that are very important as well. Equipment's oftentimes a pretty big expense for a startup operation. However, I always kind of maintain we can keep equipment costs fairly low if need be, and I would encourage you to do that. Finally, I focus most of my time here is just initial purchase on breeding stock. So I'll work in terms of having the idea that you've probably got some pasture resources to begin with, and focus more on the breeding stock side. I typically encourage folks to think about breeding stock this way. It's a major capital outlay, and if we're talking about breeding stock like cows or bred heifers, think in terms of an 8, 10, 12 year investment. So it's not enough to think about a single year. Think about a return on that breeding stock over a much longer period of time. You can kind of think of a cull cow value as being something like a salvage value. So over the course of the life of that breeding animal, whatever age she is, she should wean you a calf every year. Hopefully your expenses are lower than what the value of those calves are year in, year out. And then when she's sold as salvage value as a cull cow, she generates some sort of positive rate of return over her lifetime. Walk through some quick revenues right now. Focus this right now on what the actual current market would be with the understanding that this changes all the time. So 5 years from now, things may well be very different. So we're filming this on, I guess, August 26th of 2014. Last week's market report, week that ended last week, state average 550-pound steers in Kentucky were bringing something like $2.40 per pound. That means a typical steer going through the stockyard is worth about $1,320. A heifer, typically a little bit smaller at weaning time, we'll assume 500 pounds. Last week, heifers in that weight range, state average, were around $2.25 per pound. That would give us a steer heifer average in today's market of something like $1,225, something like that. Now, from that, a few things to keep in mind. Number one, every calf that we own is not going to wean a calf every year. So if we assume something like an 85% weaning rate, which means roughly 15% of our cows every year fail to actually wean a calf, that means we're maintaining 20 cows and getting 17 calves, for example. Okay, that's going to actually reduce that revenue per cow down to a little over $1,000 per cow. So subtracting those open cows, brought that revenue down to something like $1,040 per cow. Subtract off marketing costs, typically in the ballpark of about 3% or so of calf value. We're in the neighborhood right now of about $1,000 per cow that we maintain. Cost estimates quickly. Big cost, typically winter feeding. Oftentimes this involves hay. Hay can be purchased or it can be produced. A lot of times a small operation, startup operation, I encourage them to buy their hay if at all possible. If we assume that dry cows through the winter consume approximately 2.5 tons of hay through the winter, at roughly $70 a ton, that's a cost in hay of about $175 through the winter. If I assume I'm maintaining roughly 2 acres of pasture per cow and spending about $40 an acre maintaining those pastures, there's another $80. Mineral, $20 a bag, about 40 cents a pound, assuming a quarter pound a day throughout the year. Mineral cost around $36 or so per cow. Vet medicine costs obviously vary. This should include vaccines, wormer, a pregnancy check if you do that. I tell folks too to factor in a little bit more for the vet coming out occasionally to deal with something. should factor in some use of antibiotic and whatnot. $25 a cow is what I typically think in terms of vet cost per cow for a typical operation. Breeding costs can be fairly high. Many ways to look at this. This can be AI cost. This can be maintenance and purchase of a bull. Somewhere for most operations between $60 and $100 what it typically costs to get a cow bred every year. From there's a whole lot of other things to kind of think about. Fuel, oil for feeding, water, miscellaneous costs come up. About $40 or so more in a typical operation for that. Walking through that quick scenario, about $436 or so of kind of variable cash type cost to maintain a cow every year. I don't have time to talk in much detail, but we can oftentimes add another $150 to $300 in those kind of overhead fixed type costs. These are things like machinery depreciation, operator labor, interest on investment, things like that that are very variable by operation. And these are going to tend to be higher for smaller and startup type operations for sure. So a few things to kind of think about, my advice as you go forward. Number one, track those costs and returns and use that financial data that you collect to actually make decisions. Keep records. Decisions like which cows to cull, when to wean calves, things like that oftentimes are much easier to make if you have a good set of production records. Do the best that you can to manage overhead cost. You can start small and try to minimize major capital outlays for things like equipment and so forth. Fourth, try to value and think about the value of your time and the value and the potential opportunity cost of resources that you own like land. Finally, take advantage of resources that are out there. One in particular I want to mention to you is our enterprise budget here in the Ag Econ Department. They're an excellent way to enter some data from your individual operation and estimate cost and return specific to your situation. Take advantage of those. If you've got questions or interested, talk to your county extension agent or visit the website posted here on the screen. Thank you very much.
I'm Jeff Lehmkuhler, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist at the University of Kentucky, and today we're going to begin the discussion of beef cattle production and some very basic information. As we begin thinking about the beef cattle industry, there are multiple sectors that one could get involved in. Obviously, one of the most common ones for our state here in Kentucky is the cow-calf industry. In this part of the industry, basically what we're doing is we're managing female our cows on our pastures and on our ground, and we're producing a feeder calf that's going to be sent to the market, and that's going to be our revenue stream. However, Kentucky's also home to several other enterprises that involve obtaining those feeder cattle and adding weight to those lightweight calves and preparing them for their next journey, which is going to be the feedlot section. With our backgrounding in stockery industry, it's typical for us to be buying 300 to 500 pound calves. With today's improved genetics, we might even be seeing some folks obtaining a little heavier calves, but the general purpose is to put about 200 to 300 pounds of weight on those calves before they enter the feed yard. The feed yard is another section of the industry then where a lot of our feeder cattle then are moved to after they're here in this state. That part of the industry tends to be further west into the plains regions of the United States where the environmental conditions are a little bit more favorable for that sector of the industry. However, we do have some cattle that are finished here, and that number is growing a little bit as we begin to see a little bit improvement in infrastructure and more processing facilities being built in the state. That has increased our opportunities to finish cattle here in Kentucky. A few resource needs as we begin thinking about what would I need if I were to enter into the beef cattle industry. Land is obviously one of those. In general terms, we generally would say 3 to 5 acres per cow-calf pair, and that would include both your pasture ground and the ground that you would be obtaining your hay from. As you begin thinking about other resources, water resources are going to be one of those that are important to consider, either from municipalities or if you have streams, lakes, or other springs that you could develop for a source of water. As we begin thinking about the other things that we might need, facilities and equipment, one of our probably biggest limitations on some of our farms or our land resources might be the fencing, either because it's relatively old and needs to be repaired or replaced, or because the farm just simply doesn't have any fencing at all. As we begin thinking about building new fencing, be aware that we do have state laws regarding what is a legal fence, and you need to make sure that you follow those laws. Capital is also one of those things that you have to be thinking about as we begin into the industry. Do we have that cash available to enter into this industry? If not, where can we find that? And working with local lenders, you might be able to find some special interest rates to begin into this industry and obtain that capital to start your beef enterprise. Labor is also a key thing with many of our operations in this state. We have full-time employment off the farm or in town, and labor is a resource that we need to be sure that we manage and make sure that we have adequate labor to ensure that we are tending to the livestock and applying good animal husbandry practices. A few things from a management consideration aspect that we won't delve into any detail on today, but there are several areas when we begin thinking about beef cattle production that include some degree of management. Our top producers, and by top producers, those that are very profitable, are individuals that pay attention to these areas and do apply some management. Pastures and forages. One of the things that we often don't consider is we need to manage our pastures and forage to maximize the forage yield per unit of land. The more forage we produce, the higher quality forage we produce, the more beef per acre or per unit of land that we can produce off of that limited resource. Genetics is also another thing to consider. Reproduction, nutrition, animal health and well-being, marketing, and financial areas are all components of this system that we can apply some degree of management to improve our overall profitability.
When getting into the cattle business, it's important to first consider what resources you have available and then try and match the genetics to those resources. The first thing we think about from a resource standpoint is how much labor is involved, or really and truly think of it in terms of how much time you're going to be able to spend with your cattle. If you're a part-time operator and have an off-the-farm job, then often during calving season you'll be away from your cattle during the majority of the day. If that's the case, then you really need to consider having an extremely calving ease type bull to go on those cattle, because you don't want to come back the next day after checking them one day and find a heifer that's started into labor after you left and it had difficulty and ended up dying, or the calf dying, or both. And so it's important, particularly for that part-time guy, to make sure he has adequate calving ease. Of course, no one wants to pull calves anytime, and so even the full-time farmer needs to be a consideration of his operation, but maybe you could reduce the limits or the amount of calving ease that you put in the bull in order to get a little additional growth or other production out of the cattle. The other resource is nutrition. With nutrition, this is the one that people overlook a lot of times. You have to really consider what it is you're providing to the cattle. From a forage-based standpoint, do you have just fescue? From the nutrition standpoint, it's important to consider several factors. The first being your forage base. What kind of forages are you providing to the cattle that they're grazing on a daily basis? Is it just fescue without any legumes in it? Or are you a little more productive and have legumes interseeded into the fescue, rotationally graze, or some other factors that help increase production? Also, the availability of hay, or the quality of hay that you have available. Is it a high quality hay that's stored properly, or is it lower quality hay that you're having to store outside and just on the ground? Regardless of what the situation is, you need to try and match genetics to the reality of what resources you are providing to the cattle. So if you have that lower end type of a nutritional program where you don't have a lot of legumes in your pastures, you don't rotationally graze, you have poor quality hay, then you need to be very careful not to get extreme in terms of the production of your cattle. You don't want to choose breeds that are going to be heavy milking, high growth kind of breeds. You want to probably select something that's more moderate, that's going to give you a moderate amount of growth, a moderate amount of milking ability. If on the other side you have a very good forage program or have a lot of resources from a nutrient standpoint, then you might want to look into the more productive kind of breeds. The other thing, when we want to talk about obtaining cattle, we need to think about different sources. Of course, we're going to have females go into our herd. We're always going to have older cows that are going to depart, and so we need to decide whether or not we're going to retain our own females and put them back into the herd. If so, the bulls that we're buying need to reflect that in terms of some of the maternal components. So if you're going to purchase the heifers, then we have to think of some things like, are you going to buy bred heifers or open heifers? If you buy bred heifers, a lot of times, as long as you know the source of the sire that mated those heifers and know that it's a Calvingese bull, then that kind of gives you some freedom of the bull that you buy for your normal herd to have a little more growth opportunities in that bull. However, if you buy open heifers, then you're still going to have to buy a bull that's going to give you that calving ease on those heifers. On the cows, same thing. Whether or not you're buying bred cows or not, be sure that you know what the service sire is so that you don't get into a lot of trouble. And also, we're going to be culling cows. Typically, cows are culled because of being open, or in other words, not being bred, or for other reasons like becoming crippled or losing their teeth or things like that. And so keep on top of it. You want to cull a cow prior to her being not productive if possible, but certainly when she becomes non-productive, then that's usually the time from an economic standpoint to market that female. And then, of course, the most focus in the genetics program goes into buying the bull. Make sure that you consider your resources and buy that bull is going to fit what it is you're providing to your cattle herd.
Hi, I'm Dr. Les Anderson, Beef Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky, and I'm the Reproductive Management Specialist. And when people are first deciding on whether they're going to begin a cow-calf operation, one of the first and key decisions that they need to make is, when am I going to get my cattle bred? One of the biggest mistakes that beginning cattlemen make is that they get a few cows, they get a bull, they put the bull with the cows, and that's the end of their thought on their breeding and calving seasons. And so what we want to talk a little bit about is deciding when you might want to calve, and then how to control that breeding and calving season so that you can maximize your opportunity for profit potential. There are many advantages to a controlled calving season. The first is more uniform calf crop, and actually we're going to look at a little bit of data where you're going to be able to see that quite readily. You'll actually get heavier weaning weights, increased labor and production efficiency. Older calves typically come from controlled calving seasons, and so you have a slightly higher post-weaning gain in your calves coming from a controlled calving season than those coming from an extended calving season. And then finally, you're actually able to improve the overall productivity and profitability of your cow herd because you have more early born heifers to choose as your replacement heifers. Just an example of what can happen when you control a calving season. This was actually on-farm data collected in Washington County several years ago. This producer began calving his cow herd over a 6-month period. You can see that he had 15 calves born in March, all the way down to 2 calves born in August. And when you add up the weights, he was weaning about 400 pounds out of March and just 240 pounds out of August. So if you add these weights up, he was weaning a total of 18,614 pounds at an average of 443 pounds per female. Over 2 years, we implemented a reproductive management program where we could shorten this calving interval. And in that 2-year period, we shifted to our calving season so that 46 cows calved in March, 8 cows calved in April, and we were finished. Okay? In the initial data, we only had 42 total calves born. that averaged 443 pounds. After 2 years of controlling the breeding season, we had 54 calves born, more of them born early, and we increased our overall productivity by 11,000 total pounds of product. Hopefully you can see that there are a number of advantages to controlling the breeding and calving season. The next thing you need to do is to decide, when am I going to calve? Am I going to calve in the spring, which we typically think of as February, March, April, or May, or am I going to calve in the fall, September, October, or November? Once you make these decisions, work with your local county agent for agriculture to help implement controlled breeding and calving seasons, and your road to profitability will begin.